This is the Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program interviewing Mrs. Micheal McNarney at her home, 134 West Sinclair Street, Wabash, Indiana, Wednesday afternoon, June 12th, 1974. Mrs. McNarney, we'll just talk normal, and the first question that I want to ask you is, where were you born?
Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Yeah. And what was your maiden name?
Fox.
And your mother's and father's name?
My mother's name was Sarah Connelly Fox, and my father's name was Thomas F. Fox.
Uh-huh. And what did your father do for a living?
Well, he was a stock buyer.
Mm-hmm. For whom?
He dealt in stock himself.
Mm-hmm. And what was your mother's maiden name?
Sarah Connelly.
Connelly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how did both of them get to Fort Wayne? What was the background on that story?
Well, my father's people came from Dublin, and but my father was born here. But my mother was a friend of the families in Dublin, and she came here and married my father.
Mm-hmm. Did they move later to Wabash, Indiana?
No, oh no. I married Micheal McNarney and adopted Wabash as my home.
Mm-hmm. That was his home then?
Yes.
That was Mike's home, yeah.
He was a bookkeeper on the Pennsylvania station at Fort Wayne, and that was where I met him. And we were married at the cathedral at Fort Wayne. And Father William Sullivan, who was later our pastor here in St. Bernard's, performed the ceremony at the cathedral. He was a young assistant.
Uh-huh. Tell me about your early education, grade school, and so forth in Fort Wayne.
Well,
where did you live in Fort Wayne first?
I lived on Baker Street. Mm-hmm. That is, I lived mostly at boarding school. Mm-hmm. And then I spent much of my time with my aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Cornelius Guerin.
Yeah. Now, was that in Fort Wayne?
Well, later on, but when I was younger, they had large stock farms at Arcola, Indiana, which is out just a little beyond Fort Wayne. Mm-hmm.
Did you go to elementary school there? Did you go to grade school? No.
I attended boarding school, St. Michael's Academy, at Plymouth, Indiana, and under the auspices of the Holy Cross Sisters.
Was there a reason for this?
Well, I suppose there was, that my father had died when we were quite young, and I had a twin brother who passed away a few years ago, Peter Fox. And so I was in boarding school. I graduated from there and went on to St. Mary's. And after leaving St. Mary's,
This is the college?
Yes, at South Bend. But always the Holy Cross Sisters. And then I studied law at the University of Chicago. And I've really been interested in that ever since.
You didn't get a degree, though? You didn't stay to get a law degree?
No, I studied 2 years, and then I I have kept it up ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been many changes in the law I studied and the loopholes that we have today.
Mm-hmm. How did you meet Mike then?
Well, he lived at the home of Mrs. Bond,
Mm-hmm.
which was in the neighborhood with my people, and I met him. I don't recall the incidents, but he was a very fine, handsome young man,
Mm-hmm.
and so I guess that was
The beginning.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Did he court you long?
Couple, no, about a year.
Uh-huh.
And of course, in the meantime, his brother was in business here
Mm-hmm. In Wabash?
in Wabash.
Uh-huh.
So he left his position in Fort Wayne and became a partner at the McNarney Brothers store in it was known as the Temple Grocery.
Uh-huh.
It was in the old Masonic Temple.
Uh-huh.
And
That's where you came to Wabash then?
yes, uh-huh.
Yeah. Now, was his brother older?
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But Mike had worked on the railroad then, had worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad.
As bookkeeper.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
What was your first impression then coming to Wabash? Describe the town and...
Well, of course I had a master's in history.
Mm-hmm.
So the town fascinated me immediately.
Mm-hmm.
The old homes, the beauty of it. And my uncle was a builder himself, and after he left the farm, came to Fort Wayne, and I seemed to appreciate lumber and building and the beauty of material. And so the homes fascinated me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as always, the people are Wabash. It's the people.
Mm-hmm.
They're unique.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, it was a beautiful, easygoing, cultural little community.
Yeah. Would you describe the grocery store that was in the Masonic Temple in those days?
Well, it was a typical high class as far as food, as far as looks. It was a homemade country store.
Mm-hmm.
Sugar in barrels and flour in barrels and candy in large quantities and cookies in barrels and no packaged goods at all.
Mm-hmm.
And we had everything in that store. And then on the outside in the back, we sold coal oil because many people had coal oils, stoves and coal oil lamps at that time. It was a very happy atmosphere. Micheal loved his customers and they loved him.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in there for many years. And finally the electric light building wanted the entire frontage. And we went, we had to move.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. McNarney felt that the end of the world had come. But he bought a store and from McCaffrey's in Peru, and our business increased, and it was a more modern-looking store. In fact, the modern store.
Where was this located on?
On
West Market?
yes,
West, yeah, that was where I knew when.
And when we went out of business, Joe Yarnell purchased the building.
Did his brother live until the end of the business?
No. He died many years, but he was with us when we purchased the Market Street store, and worked in that for some time, for several years. And we had the best beat. My husband would never put in inferior food. And he had the agencies for many foods that couldn't be bought anywhere else. And
Did you work in the store too?
no,
Yeah.
no.
What were you doing these years when his business career was developing?
Well, I was keeping house, and there was a great deal of social life in Wabash then. Great deal. And we entertained in the homes, and had large parties. And Alice Tower was the cateress, and everyone had her. And there was a party every week someplace, and a big party. And we looked forward to that, and that was the age of gracious living.
Where were you living in those days?
Where?
Yes. Where was the family home?
Well, we went to housekeeping on East Maple Street. The house that sets out towards the walk, pretty much. It's about the third house on East Maple off of Wabash Street. Still there. And Lombergs owned it. And to show you the changing times, we paid $10.50 a month rent. And the 50 cents was water. That was the water rent.
I'll be darned.
And we lived there for about a year, and then we bought a very beautiful home that Dr. Kern had built for his mother. But she only lived in there 8 months and was visiting in Louisville and died. So we purchased that, and that it was considered the nicest small home in Wabash. Beautiful woodwork.
Where was that?
It was on Maple Street too. I believe it was, I can't recall the number, but Mrs. Alice Zimmer lives in it now. You know where she is?
Yes, I know the house, yes. That's up on the
Yes.
on that little embankment there, yeah, on the north side of the street. Right across from Dixon's old house.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, no, honey, down this way.
Next block.
It's right across from Jenny Brady's.
Right, you're right, next block.
That one was another house.
And then where did you finally land? And that was the house that the children grew up in?
Well, no. I was fond of remodeling old homes. That was a natural, I guess, a born instinct. And there's where Mary Helen was spent several years of her childhood, and there were only two bedrooms and no way of making another bedroom. So several years later, when we knew another child we were to be blessed with another child, and it was a blessing, Alice. We decided it was too small, so we purchased an old home, I think it was Barrett's home, down here on the corner of Main and, was it Carroll? Where Mrs. Temple used to live. And we remodeled that and made an apartment out of it. And there Alice was born. And that was a beautiful place. Mm-hmm. It had deteriorated, but the makings of a beautiful home was there, mm-hmm. the woodwork and everything. Mm-hmm. So we lived there for a long time, and somebody wanted to buy it, and Rosalind Rosalind Switzer, and her aunt rented the apartment. Uh-huh. And of course, she's Mrs. Ford now, the oldest boy's name. Mm-hmm. And there too we had many happy parties, and friends were friends then. Uh-huh. And a few people had cars and would share them, mm-hmm. share the joy of a car and the many blunders of a car. Had side curtains, and we'd have to get out if there was a rain coming and put on the side curtains, and travel over gravel roads. But we thought we had a wonderful time, which we did, because friendship was different, and loyalties were different, and everything was different.
Let's break this talk into 2 or 3 categories, and first let's talk about the church. Let's talk about you coming from a large Catholic community and coming into a relatively small community where Catholics were in a distinct minority, and develop that for me. And
well, that too, of course, being a devout Catholic and a staunch Catholic, and having a background of Catholic education, I appreciated the other people's creeds. So I was not narrow and not prejudiced. And even in those days, I attended other functions in other churches, and so Christianity was my motto. I feel I've always been a Christian and have always lived it, and respected anyone else's creed. But the Catholic Church then had been purchased. Father Pratt, who was a very dear friend of my aunt and uncle's, In fact, in Arcola, they practically built a church for him. And he was a convert and had been a Methodist and became a Catholic and later a priest. So it wasn't a strange environment at all. And the old church was beautiful. Of course, it was upstairs, and downstairs was a chapel and a hall and one thing or other. And the only problem about the old church was funerals. It was a terrible task for the men to take these heavy caskets up a rather narrow stairs and make a turn. And it seemed that my husband and Mike Collins were the official pallbearers.
They buried everyone.
They buried everyone. And the Rosary Sodality was very active, and much of the social life in the church was through that. Then we also had a Holy Name Society and a Young Ladies Altar Society. And then we didn't have a school at that time, but Teresa Laughlin, who later became a nun on the Holy Cross, always had the vocation, but remained at home until the death of her mother and father. And she was equivalent to a community of nuns. She kept the church in perfect order and decorated the altars and did everything of that type. She also taught Sunday school and Saturday catechism, and Mary Knirk was another teacher, and Mrs. Collins, and I would help out quite often, and that was a pleasure for me. So that then later on, Father Pratt was transferred to Kokomo, and William Sullivan, Father William Sullivan, came here, and of course he was the young priest that had performed our marriage. So it was always like an old home week. And then of course Father Lay came, and at that time the school was...
What was the reaction among the Catholic community, and particularly with Mr. McNarney being in business, when the Ku Klux Klan raised its head around Wabash County?
Well,
Not much has been told about this, by the way.
There hasn't.
No.
Well, the Ku Klux Klan was very, very evident here. And they had they met out in what was later on the stock barn, out in the center now. There were many of them. And, of course, they were secret, and there were many people who were asked to quit the store, but they never did. They had no reason to quit, because Mr. McNarney was not prejudiced, I was not prejudiced, and the children were not. And the children, although Ku Klux Klans were around them everywhere, we never talked about it in front of them. And I remember one night I was over to Molly Whitmore's, which was the outstanding seamstress. She was the extra good one. And the two good Ku Klux Klans were there, two women. And they had been talking to Molly to join. So I interrupted my presence coming in interrupted that. And I was bound to outstay them, which I did. And finally one of them said, "What do you think?" They weren't conscious that I knew they were Klanswomen. And one of them said, "What do you think will be the effect of the Klans on your business, Miss McNarney?" And I truthfully answered the way I felt. I said, "I have more faith in God than to even think that He would allow any man or any group of men to interfere with our business." And she said, "I hadn't thought of it that way." And I didn't hear anything more. And I was asked, and I knew many of my friends were Klanswomen.
Who was running the whole thing here? What was running it? What was making it go?
Well, there were the White Horsemen. I just don't, since everything was secret, you never didn't know for sure.
Yeah.
You just had suspicions of who was doing it.
Was Mike fearful for his
No.
safety or business? Or?
No, he was not.
Yeah.
Now, I was told that some other people had threats, but we were never fearful.
Yeah.
Of course, we had implicit faith in God, and I'm still here,
Yeah.
and the Klan has risen and fallen, and prejudice is less, I think, much less than it was.
I think so.
And I have never flaunted my religion, but I have never denied it.
And tell me that you and Mike lived close to Don Nixon when you're, I would say, probably your early years of marriage. And Don was quite a rugged individualist. And what was your impression of him as a neighbor and a friend? And
Well, I knew Mrs. Nixon, I think the first day she came here. And,
that would have later been Mrs. Honeywell.
yes.
Yes.
And she was a beautiful young bride. I think she was about 20, she must have been 27 years old, because she wasn't too much younger than myself, and at that time years meant nothing. And Scott Davis had converted his beautiful home on Miami Street into an apartment. The house had outgrown them after this family was gone. And of course houses were scarce, very scarce. I think that was in 23. And 51 years ago. So they moved in this apartment, and Mrs. Nixon, I hate that she, don't let me use that. Mrs. Nixon was a very gracious person, and of course a great musician. That was her ambition, to be a concert pianist. And she practiced several hours each day. and I just don't recall how long they lived there. Perhaps several months, perhaps a year or so. And Madge Richmeyer was a friend on the other side of her, and Madge was a very fine, unmarried woman, rather eccentric, and was bookkeeper for many years at the Bradley drugstore. And Mrs. Mrs. Nixon was very good to her, and I don't mean that Madge needed anything, but she was just unusually kind to her, and that was the type of person she was. And then later on, they purchased the house, or I believe it was, the house that Joe Nixon is living in now,
Yes.
on the corner of Maple and Miami. And that was built by the president of a factory here, who knew and loved wood. And every room is solid wood of some sort, cherry or mahogany. And it's a very handsome house.
Well, then you became neighbors again then,
Yes.
when you moved on to Maple?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And so, yes, we were neighbors from the very first.
Neighbors down on Main, and then neighbors
No,
up?
not on Main.
Not on Main?
We had moved up to, we bought an old house up on Ferry Street and remodeled that, made it into an apartment. And that was right around where Hodels lived now.
Yes.
And a very, very pretty place. And so we were neighbors right from the first. And Don Nixon was the publisher of the paper and very controversial. However, I had great respect for him. He published things as he saw them. And he had some ideas of cleaning up some vices, and naturally he was not too popular. And that reflected on his wife, unfortunately. But he had a fine mind, and we were fond of him. And his grandson is very much like him, young Don. And that's Joe's son.
Yes.
And he probably is a little more diplomatic than his grandfather was, but he follows in his footsteps very much. So I'm fond of the Nixons.
Did you meet them socially then? And
Oh, yes, because there was no divisions there. She had many little parties, and everyone else did, and there were just, it seemed like an endless group of people that were socialized, and when she'd have a party, it was always very nice, but nothing elaborate. And of course, her son John was born in that house, and I knew him from the third day he was born. And she reared him to be a very fine man.
Do you remember when Mr. Nixon died then? When
Yes,
John
I
was
do.
Killed?
He was killed in an accident, and I think he lay in state in that house, and it was a shock to the community. And Mrs. Fox, Mr. and Mrs. Fox, I think they were with some factory here. I don't recall if it was the container or something. They later moved to Marion. They lived on the corner where Skaggs lived now, Dale Skaggs. And she was a very loyal friend to Mrs. Nixon. And with a controversial background, you needed friends. And I always admired the loyalty that Mrs. and Mr. Fox showed. And so that was, then of course, Mrs. Nixon inherited the papers, which are many, and she became very efficient in the work. And Mrs. Kelly was her personal secretary during Kelly. And Mrs. Kelly had a magnificent mind combined with a wonderful personality. So she handled Mrs. Nixon's work very, very well.
Go ahead.
After Don passed away, I prefer to say died. After Don died, Mrs. Hubbard came to live with her daughter, Mrs. Nixon, and from Terre Haute, I think it was. And she had been a cateress. You know, those were the days when everyone had these caterers. And she was an extraordinary good one. And she had this large house and was a very ambitious woman, fine-looking woman. And Marie Bowman's mother, and she became very staunch friends. And so Mrs. Hubbard let out rooms, and there were 3 or 4 very handsome young men there. And the one I remember, of course, best is Tom McSpadden. He lived there. And the others married and moved away, but Tom was one of Mrs. Hubbard's favorite people.
She rented rooms up in the house that Joe lives in now?
Yes,
And Mrs. Nixon was still living there with son John?
And
that's all it'd be, just the 3 of them, Mrs. Hubbard. Yeah.
And
do you remember Mr. Honeywell coming onto the scene then?
Oh, yes.
Well, let's start back when you first met Mr. Honeywell. Let's develop his career.
Oh, that's an interesting thing because, as I told you before, being interested in the history, anyone that had any marks of history about him was an interest to me immediately. So when I came here, I was told of about his life, his youth, and how people predicted he would never amount to anything because he was a loner. He was a dreamer. And so when I came here, he had a small shop on Miami Street. I think around where Bob Bostic used to have his law office, right in there. And Marvel Walrod was his secretary, and Hazel Mertz was the bookkeeper, and then his nephew, a young vice boy, not Jim's, but his wife's sister's son, worked for him. And Mark and Mr. Tillman were plumbers, and of course he was constantly striving for perfection and ironing out blunders, and he hit upon this invention that made him a millionaire, and many times a millionaire. And the invention was patented and statewide at first, and now it's internationally known. And it has amazed me and fascinated me to know a man that in a few years claimed such success. And he married Mrs. Lutz, or Miss Lutz. And Mr. Lutz wasn't too fond of him, so they eloped. And after many years and a childless marriage, she passed away.
Did you know her well?
Yes, I knew her.
And what do you remember about Olive?
Well, Olive was, she was from one of the best families, the Lutzes, and they lived in a beautiful old brick home down here on the corner, which is destroyed now, and a shame that these beautiful homes had to be demolished. But, and she had three sisters, Mrs. Weiss, and two others. One lived in Marion. I knew them very well, but I just don't recall their names right now. Her one sister died just a few years ago here.
Did you ever travel as a younger person with that group, or were they older than you, or?
No, we belonged to a card club together with
Olive?
No, Olive's sister.
Olive's sister.
And Olive was older, and quite a little older.
Could you, as a neighbor, could you see this romance blossom between Mr. Honeywell and Mrs. Nixon?
Oh yes, oh yes. He called there often, and everyone was concerned about it, and speculating about it. Some said they were just friends and dinner companions, and others thought there would be a consummation of love there, and which did happen. And then they moved into Mr. Honeywell's home on Wabash Street.
Come in, come in.
They were married out of town, I think, in his home in Florida.
They were.
And he had a beautiful home down there. And of course he was a connoisseur of beauty of any kind. And they moved into his home on Wabash Street. And Mrs. Honeywell redecorated the upstairs, but he wanted the downstairs to remain as is. And I was there to a party, and she took us through the upstairs. New chintz drapes and bedspreads and everything in beautiful taste. So they lived a happy life and did a great deal of travel, of course. And
Did she and Mark share the same rooms upstairs, or
oh yes,
wasn't a separate or
no,
platonic relationship?
no,
Yeah.
no. It was a real marriage, and I think he fell in love with her charm and her ability, because she was working up to being a concert pianist, and that he liked, and that she became. Now, when she lived with Mr. Nixon, she spent many hours, 7 and 8 hours a day practicing. And at that time, too, I might say that Ann Smith, who is still living, was Mr. Nixon's secretary. And she knew their lives and their likes and dislikes and so on and so forth. But I think it's nice to bring in the people who are still living. Too many of these fine people are leaving Wabash, are dying. And with each death, there's a culture that passes.
It's not by choice, I'm sure.
No.
Go ahead.
However, I don't think the same culture will ever be here again.
What was your reaction to the new Mrs. Honeywell now, Eugenia, with Don, her son, staying with Mrs. Hubbard, with her mother? What was your reaction? What do you think the community reaction was?
Well, I think it was, John was a very democratic boy. Very. And everyone loved him. He didn't overdress, he didn't overdo anything. His allowance seemed to be very limited, and his clothes were no better than the boys in high school. And of course he was the apple of his grandmother's eye. And the Brady boys used to spend a great deal of time down there. Jenny, the Brady's boys, lived on Maple Street. And John would come up there, and he was like his mother. He was fond of people. And it wasn't dollars or cents, it was just people, what they were. And that's the kind of a man he's grown to be.
Yeah. But you don't think there was any reaction to him staying with his grandmother while she moved with Mr. Honeywell?
No. Oh, some people made comments, but Mark didn't have any children of his own, and he was growing older and set in his ways, so it was only the natural thing.
Mm-hmm.
And but John was with his mother
Mm-hmm.
a great deal,
Mm-hmm.
and she with him over at the
Other house, yeah.
grandmother's home.
Yeah.
Home. At that time, that was the grandmother's home.
Uh-huh.
She later on willed it to John.
Mm-hmm.
So,
What was Mr. Honeywell like? I mean, I hear so many different descriptions of his character and his personality. Really, what is your impression of Mr. Honeywell, Mark Honeywell?
well, as a young man, he was much older than I when I came here, but he was a young man, see, and I thought he was quite nice looking. He wore his clothes well, and he was considered, as I say, a loner from boyhood. Mm-hmm. So naturally, he was not an aggressive person at all. Mm-hmm. But he loved Wabash, and you can tell by the memorial and the things that he did for Wabash that he was loyal to his community. And then I don't think there are any perfectionists. I think there might be a frustrated idealist. However, that's just, but if there were perfectionists, then Mark Honeywell was one. Mm-hmm. About everything. And, of course, he built the memorial for his wife and his parents. It was the Honeywell Memorial. And that was a beautiful, beautiful place, as it still is. And he put in a dining room, and Mrs. Hodel ran the dining room. And she was as near a perfectionist as Mark. Mm-hmm. And everything had a look of elegance when he and she were running it.
Right, very true.
The salads and everything, he would send her to Chicago to take training. And of course, it isn't that way now.
Oh. What? Now you were closely associated with Mrs. Honeywell in Mr. Honeywell's last illness, and would you care to tell me about those circumstances that brought this about?
Well, I was legislator for 11 years for the mental health. And Mr. Honeywell's last illness.
Excuse me. I think I'll end part 2 here and put another tape. We were discussing the Mr. Honeywell and how you were associated with Mrs. Honeywell and his final illness, and that's
well, every Thursday she would drive to Indianapolis, and she was very generous about taking anyone. So once a month on Thursday I would drive right down with her. Mm-hmm. And we would have our meeting at the old Claypool Hotel, And of course I would stay overnight and come home. Usually got a ride home, somebody in Fort Wayne or someplace. But I would have a 2-day session, and of course she would be down there just for a day. Sometimes he knew her, sometimes he didn't. I am courting her now. But he was always, she kept a valet for him, and he was always just dressed immaculate, which he wanted to be. He never got away from that idea of perfection. And it seemed to me a tragedy that he had to end his days in that condition. Of course, he was happy because he had no worries of the past and no thoughts of the future. So probably he was the happiest of any time in his life. And I would ride down with her, and anyone else that wanted to go. And the Jewish people, as you know, will not build an entirely new house. They will build around. So Mrs. Beichman and I had been close associates through the clubhouse. She was the first president of it, and while it was in the making, and I was the vice president. So she bought a big old house, the Murgy property, on Hill Street, and had it moved up to the present location, and that fascinated me. And perhaps on account of my background of history, I noted every little thing that other people might have just taken for granted, or that's a peculiar thing or something. But then she cut that big house right in two and built. And they lived there very happily. And her sister, who was a very wealthy woman, was widowed, and she and her son came to live with Mrs. Beichman. The house was tremendous, and they lived all over it and enjoyed it. And they had a fire there one time, but it was smoke damage. They had a sale and sold a lot of beautiful things that were damaged by smoke. So one day Mrs. Honeywell was, we were going down to Indianapolis, and she said, do you know anything about the Beichman house? And I said, oh, I know all about that. It just fascinates me. So I told all about it, and she said, didn't they have a fire at one time? And I said, yes, but not a destructive flame fire. It was a more smoke destruction than anything. And she said, do you think it's a well-constructed house? And I said, like a fortress and one thing or other. So I held the floor most of the time answering questions. And when we were reaching the Claypool, she said, I am so glad to get all this information. She said she had told about the beautiful grounds which we knew were, and how she liked them so much. And she said, I'm going to close the deal today. I'm going to buy it. Well, I was glad I hadn't said anything ill about it, but I couldn't have, because that was the way I felt about the place. Well, of course, she remodeled that place beautifully, and then had designers and decorators from New York come. And in that home there were many cases where there was just one of a kind in it.
Mm-hmm.
And she was very generous with it, and loved to have people come. And she was, in the meantime, she was a Christian Scientist and a good one, but she had her bad days with arthritis and things of that type. But, and of course when these symphonies would come, she would entertain them, and it was most generous.
Mm-hmm.
And the house looked like a setting from some movie. And she was interested, which I want to say, she was very interested in my work with senior citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we were going to have honorary membership. Hardgarver and Mr. Dr. Kent and Mr. William Quinn. And I asked Mrs. Honeywell over the phone if she would be an honorary member. And she said, "Oh, I have turned down so many." She said, "I'd love to, but I just don't feel I'm up to it." And I thought, well, the phone is a good place to say no. And I didn't want anybody to know that I might be turned down, because I'm not used to that. I have never been known that was asked to be on the board.
Right.
So I took a taxi and went up there by appointment. She could see me and had time to see me. And she consented without much pressure to be on our board, an honorary member. She said, at first she didn't want to. She said, "I know you'll have me giving a book review or something." I said, "No, not ask you to do anything you don't want to do." And by a strange coincidence, the money, we had little extra gift certificates of appreciation on the Monday following her funeral. And she was to have been there.
Yes.
And really, like I wrote a brief note to the boys, John and Joe, and I said that never since word of President Kennedy's assassination was there so much grief and concern shown in Wabash.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that Mrs. Honeywell, like John F. Kennedy, would never be a memory, but always a radiant personality. And I truly feel that, because not on account of her money, but on account of her personality and her graciousness. And in her years of grief and sorrow, she had them.
Mm-hmm.
She was just as gracious as she was in the more prosperous, extremely prosperous years. And that home was hers. It was not in the foundation. That she told me herself. So now it goes to Indiana, I believe.
Right. Do you think that I asked this question to many others also, do you feel that the community has fully recognized the contributions that the Honeywells have made to the community?
No, they just do not. I didn't myself until I became so involved in the senior citizens movement. Mm-hmm. And that has been over a period of many years.
But what I'm saying is, should the community have gone and named a street? Should they have, out of some spontaneous burst of enthusiasm, named a school? Should we have named a park rather than the Honeywells coming and say, here, I'm building a center, I'm building a swimming pool?
Out of courtesy and appreciation, I think you are so right.
Yeah.
We should have named.
Yes.
A Mark Honeywell street or a park or something.
Yeah. Rather than them coming and giving it, would you say?
Yes. They have given everything.
Yeah.
We have given very little in recognition. We've taken it all.
Right.
And so I think that we missed, we still can do it, but it would have been nice to have done something that they were living to see. Just some little appreciation. Mm-hmm. Because the human heart is ever the same. Mm-hmm. No matter how much you do, you don't, and they didn't do it for glory. They did it for the city. But in return, I think, pardon me, I think the city should have said, well, we will recognize this and bring it up to the council and have I think it's been a thoughtless thing. And now that Mrs. Honeywell is gone, I believe people have begun to think of what might have been. And
I think that's true. Yeah, very true.
So I feel that she was a great woman, and she was never she never flaunted her wealth or prestige. She was ever the same. Mm-hmm. And as she said to me, which I knew years ago, that she was a poor girl with ambitions, and her ambition was music, and she was going to succeed, and she did. And she never got away from that, from just being Mrs. Honeywell, the individual.
I think that's good. That's a good tribute and a compliment to her and to the family. Would you have anything else you'd like to add to the tape? Reminiscences, reflections, or anything of... I've asked you about the Ku Klux Klan and the Honeywells. How about the Depression? How did you survive the Great Depression of the 30s?
Well, in the first place, we are positive thinkers. Well, in the first place, I would say we have implicit faith in God. And in the second place, we are positive thinkers. The children never knew there was a depression. And we survived it. I don't know how. When Mr. McNarney turned the books over to me, he said, now maybe you can collect some of this, after he had retired. There's $40,000 on the books, and that was a lot of money during and after the Depression. So, but we survived, and many people didn't, and we never went to bed hungry, and many of our people did. And if they didn't go to bed hungry, they never went to bed completely satisfied. Because I don't know what would happen now if we had a depression with the price of rice and beans. But at the price of rice and beans then, that's what people lived on.
Macaroni, too.
And macaroni, all starch, and very little meat. And then another thing that we survived were the stamps. That was a heartache. These rationing stamps during the war.
World War II, yes.
And Mr. McNarney was so nervous. And just from these stamps, you know. And it is, I feel sorry for the merchant now with all the red tapes and all the bookkeeping they have to do. But the stamps added a great deal of work. And I said to him, our daughter Alice was an officer in the Waves at that time, and she was in Jacksonville. And he was very fond of her. And I said, Michael, take a vacation. Oh, he said, I can't. My customers are so used to me. I said, well, just try it. So we put a little item in the paper that the store would be closed for 3 weeks. And his customers were delighted. They brought him in suitcases, they brought him in gifts. They realized he needed this rest. So he left the building needed some remodeling and some redecorating. The paper had grown yellow with age and one thing or other. And Mr. McNarney left here by bus Sunday morning at 8 o'clock or 8:30, and then he was going to fly to Jacksonville out of Indianapolis. And at 10 o'clock, I had 2 gangs of paper and the painters in.
Mm-hmm.
And we got that all redecorated and redone
Mm-hmm.
in beautiful shape. He didn't know anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
He would have worried if he had. And Mr. Mater was, and Bill Wenzeldinger, the butcher, the meat cutter, and Mr. Mater, our faithful clerk, just helped me in every way. I never worked so hard in my life as I did while that was being done. Oh, that was work, changing everything, you know. But he came back to it, and he was so delighted and surprised. And he was to come open for business on Monday morning after he came back Sunday. And we had all the supplies in and everything ready for him. And the Palombos, during his time, his vacation, Pearl Palumbo died suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
And but the boys got everything over to the store for Monday morning. So I don't know. I've had a very very happy and very eventful life. And of course I've traveled a great deal and met the great and the near great, and all that is a joy to me. If I want to reminisce, I have very little time because I do a lot of writing and so on and so forth. But to me, I would say in closing that there are other cities just as good as Wabash, but there are none better.
Very good. Thank you. This interview by George Dingledye.